She was mocked by the king on her knees, the velvet of his cloak brushing her shoulder as the court laughed, the crown tilting like a verdict. They called her nothing but a broken woman. They whispered that her silence was weakness. What they did not see was the slow, cold work of a mind that refused to be small, the steady counting of debts that time would collect. By dawn, the same laughter would curdle into pleading, and the man who bent the kingdom to his will would find himself begging for mercy from the woman he humiliated. This is the story of how humiliation became a weapon, how a court's cruelty set into motion a reckoning no crown could stop. If you want the full, unvarnished tale, the betrayals, the moral choices, and the moment the balance of power snapped, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest. They led her into the great hall like a common criminal, not because she had stolen coin or bloodied a neighbor, but because a crown found spectacle more nourishing than justice. The tapestries hung heavy with faded battles and saints, the candles guttering against the draught that always found its way through the arrow slits. Courtiers arranged themselves like a small forest of spears and silk. Some watched with the indulgent curiosity of those who have never been ashamed, others with the quiet cruelty of people who measure a person by how loudly they can laugh. She kept her eyes down. That was the first thing the king wanted, a performance of brokenness. Her name had once been spoken with titles: a dowry broker in the north, a minor house with a line of landless knights. Time had not been kind. A plague, a failed marriage, a son sold into a lordly household for survival. Men who had once kissed her hand now bowed to opportunity, and the king, who loved power as other men loved wine, sensed theater in humiliation. He stepped from his dais with the cambered stride of a man who believes a kingdom is nothing but a mirror for his mood. He mocked her gently at first, the small, sharp jokes that are meant to break a person into fragments for everyone's amusement. She folded into the laughter like a practiced player, making herself small enough to be seen as harmless. That night, in the stone-smelling dark after the hall emptied, and the stench of burning fat in sconces settled into memory, she did not sleep. Her fingers, calloused by needlework and ledger marks, traced the seam of the dress the queen had given her for pity. She remembered the moment the king's laughter had skittered away from her like a dog from an approaching storm. She felt sharply and with a precision that made her shiver, the ledger of debts. Not the one with numbers inked in soot, but the slow accumulation of every slight, every refusal of a hand when hands should have been offered. Revenge, she had learned, was not a sudden act, but a long arithmetic, a list of names, interests, and habits to be turned into leverage. In the days that followed, she returned to the market and the petty courts, where disputes were settled with more honesty than at the royal table. She listened in taverns and by the river bank. She watched a scribe with careful hands and noticed which nobles preferred the tavern's ale to the wine of the palace. She learned here, because she had to learn, how rumors moved like wet cloth across a roof, where they stuck and where they slipped off. Small things accreted into a plan. Who kept a mistress in the north that the king suspected but could not prove? Which steward was in debt to a grain merchant who ran messages? A midwife who remembered a birth in a stable that no record possessed. She made note of the king's patterns, the nights he left the palace to wander his lands alone, the names he whispered in sleep, the old friend who still came with letters from abroad. Power, she discovered, had holes in it like old chain mail. A jest in a great hall could become a barbed whisper in a tavern. A dismissed servant could be coaxed into loyalty with a promise that remembered their face. She cultivated a quiet steadiness. She paid a silversmith with the last of her coin to make a ring, not for fashion, but for information. And she spent a winter sewing more than gowns. She mended alliances to the vicar who had been overlooked by the king. She gave a gift that restored an old parish right. To a ward of the exiled count, she offered a place to shelter. Each act bought a single small debt that might be called upon later. Her son, now a young man serving a minor lord, began to move in ways that suggested he had been taught a different sort of obedience, the trade of listening. He became a courier of news, seemingly by chance, and his reports carried the kind of detail that makes a mind at the palace pay attention. The king, meanwhile, continued his theatrics. He wanted spectacle as nourishment, and his court obligingly produced scenes of humiliation when he was bored. Each time he mocked her in public, he left behind a new trace, a guard who would later lament his pay, a valet whose pride had been wounded, a secretary whose ledger showed different numbers than the treasury claimed. She made a catalogue of those traces, and in the quiet hours, she converted each into a line of leverage. People call such patience virtuous when it belongs to saints, and monstrous when it belongs to those they envy. She felt neither title fit. Instead, she felt the cold arithmetic of survival and the heat of a moral calculus that complicated itself daily. She would not strike at the king in a single dramatic blow. She had seen where such blows landed. Innocent heads rolled, old pacts burned, a kingdom bruised. Instead, she would make the king fruit of his own manner, to make his court notice what they had missed, to assemble against him a mosaic of small betrayals that in themselves were petty, but together would form a pattern a conscience could not ignore. The first serious fracture appeared in a place the king trusted most, his household accounts. A clerk, a man with trembling hands and a name forgotten by song, presented papers that did not add up. The king dismissed it, laughed at the suggestion that his gold could be missing. He drank, as kings do, the certainty of his invulnerability. But the vicar who had been given restored rights, now a friend in the right pew, noticed the ledger and whispered to a counselor who had a thirst for order. The whisper became a file. The file became a petition. The petition reached a magistrate in the city who had a secret grudge and an appetite for scandal. Small pieces clicked into place like a lock yielding. On the day the chamberlain received a sealed letter that named the steward and the grain merchant in a scheme more intricate than petty theft, the king felt a tug at his sleeve, the first moment of an unraveling he had not caused. He rose from his table to query a steward who met him with eyes full of cold arithmetic that mirrored her own. The king's voice, which had once been practiced to humiliate her, sounded measured in this new exchange. For the first time since the laughter, something in the hall shifted, as if a hidden wind had turned the pages of a book, and something crucial was now visible. And in that hush, as the king leaned forward to demand who dared send such a letter, a servant who had been overlooked stepped forward and laid a small, simple ring on the table. The ring she had commissioned in the winter, the ring that bore a mark known only to a handful of people. The ring was a key. What it opened was not known aloud yet, but those who saw it paled. The king's smile faltered, and for the first time the hall felt less like theater than a trap. When the ring was set upon the table, A dozen histories converged in a single, silent second. It bore the old mark of the exiled count, a family device the court had been taught to sneer at for a generation. For those who remembered the exile, it was proof of an old compact. For those who had profit to protect, it was a dangerous relic. The chamberlain's fingers trembled. The king's laugh, which had once been an instrument, hit a wrong note and splintered. They opened the ledger. Paper and wax do not lie forever. Names, dates, shipments, a tapestry of favors and coin that led not outward to the market, as the king insisted, but inward to his own private pockets, to a string of holdings created to fund a mistress's household and to bribe foreign captains. The grain merchant's ledgers matched the steward's handwriting. The steward's handwriting matched the king's seal on certain dispatches. The dispatches matched payments to a ship registered under an alias. Every small betrayal she had catalogued now read like a sentence. Panic is a particular kind of music in a court. It starts soft and then becomes a drum. The king's first impulse was to command, as kings always had done when the world presented a problem larger than their appetite. He ordered the guards to seize the ring-bearer, to arrest the vicar, to lock the chamberlain away in the oubliette beneath the palace. He thought the machinery of fear would reset the stage. But fear, when it is well broked, has margins. The vicar had the right of sanctuary. The clerk had a patron in the merchants' guild. The steward had been photographed by a scribe while visiting a shipbroker. The midwife had a sworn testimony from the stable hand, who had borne witness to a transfer. No one wanted to remember. The meshes she had mended now held true. Her son, who had spent years carrying messages like a harmless errand boy, put down reports that were not merely hearsay, but sworn statements with witnesses' names and dates. A cohort of those small debts she had paid now spoke. A valet who had been humiliated in the hall, a guard whose wages had been stolen and replaced with scraps, a midwife whose oath had been broken. They lined up in a corridor that smelled of lint and cold metal and told one by one what they had seen. The court had expected spectacle. Instead, it found testimony. The king, white-faced and suddenly human, tried to bargain. He offered titles, land, pardons. Offers in the face of accusation are a form of confession. The more lavish the offer, the smaller the claim to innocence. A steward thrust forward parchment, revealing transfers to a manor now bought in his name. An offer from the king, purchased with the people's grain. A counselor who had once laughed at her found himself saying in a voice that had lost its silk that he had signed for shipments he had never inspected. The king's power was not so much removed as unstitched. Outside the palace walls, murmurs became a tide. Markets quieted, merchants counted coin, and reconsidered the loyalty of a throne that could not account for bread. The priests, who had once blessed the king's gestures, began to hedge their sermon with caution. Even ambassadors, who kept their faces carefully blank in public, sent urgent notes, not of support, but of concern for stability. The world the king believed himself to own was tilting toward the arithmetic she had always preferred, a ledger of truth. In those final hours, he tried to reclaim his role as spectacle. He mounted the dais and called for judgment, expecting the hall to dissolve into the familiar theater of mockery and applause. Instead, the chamber was full of faces that had been measured by a different scale. The queen, whose pity had furnished the dress she wore the night of her humiliation, stood silent, not in forgiveness, but in the calculation born of watching a marriage reduced to exchange and expediency. The king looked to the queen for rescue, and found only the mirror of his own choices. She walked to the dais with the slow, even step of someone who has rehearsed restraint. There was none of the dramatic flourish he had favored. There was instead a ledger laid out in her hands, not a weapon, but a record. She recited evenly each name and each wrong, the small betrayals that together amounted to treason of trust, if not treason of land. Her voice was unadorned. It made the court listen, because it did not seek to inflame, only to reckon. When she finished, the silence that followed was not emptiness, but the hold before a bell tolls. The king tried then the refuge of bluster and command. His throat tightened, and the words he used to slice and deride found no purchase. He descended from his dais, the king who had mocked her on his knees the month before now, the one whose breath shook. For the first time, the royal garments felt like a costume, thread and dye without the authority that made them real. He fell to his knees not to perform, but to plead his hands, the same hands that had arranged humiliation like entertainment, trembled as they reached for mercy. "Have mercy," he said, and the words were thin as a candle snuff. He begged not merely for pardon, but for his life, for the survival of the name and the throne. He spoke of legacy and the children who would inherit what was left. A dozen men in the hall shifted. Mercy, when it is asked from a man who made his own cruelties an art, is a question that contains its own verdict. She looked at him as one might look at a ledger that finally makes a sense. The choice lay before her like a simple accounting. Revenge that would splinter the kingdom, or a measured justice that might change its course. She could have demanded the gallows, the kind of spectacular end that would have satisfied those who believed humiliation should be returned in kind. Instead, she chose a different calculus. She demanded his confession in front of the court, the restitution of stolen goods to the merchants, and the appointment of a council to oversee the treasury for a generation. She demanded the king relinquish certain powers that had allowed him to build those private coffers. The king begged. He offered names, promises, tears. He promised reform and begged to be kept alive to enact it. He did not know then that mercy, when granted as a lesson, can be its own punishment. The council she had insisted upon would watch him. The restitution would empty his secret stores, and the confession would be inked into the record that every child in the kingdom could read. As he stood to speak, the room held its breath. Then, in a voice stripped of pretense, he admitted what they already suspected, that his desire had long outstripped his duty, that his spectacles of humiliation were too often a mask for a man who took to quell private fear. His words were a surrender and a revelation. The twist the court did not expect was not only that he begged for his life, but that in pleading, he named a truth that turned many allegiances into questions. He spoke the name of a man abroad who had funded some of his schemes, a foreign hand that now had a claim. The kingdom, it seemed, had been sold in whispers, and the real danger was not merely hunger at home, but the slow theft of sovereignty. In the end, she spared his life, but she did not spare the kingdom the truth. The lesson she left was small and brutal. Power that feeds on humiliation eats the hand that holds it. If you would change a realm, you must first change how you measure what matters. And if you want more stories where power meets consequence, Subscribe to our channel. Every tale teaches a history, and every history a warning.